The cabin still smelled like cedar and the lake even in February, even with 3 feet of snow pressing against the windows. My parents bought that cabin on Lake Muskoka in 1996, back when a teacher's salary and a millwright's overtime could still stretch far enough to buy 40 feet of shoreline if you were patient and didn't mind a roof that needed replacing. My father, Gerald, worked Saturdays at the mill for 9 straight years to pay it off early. My mother, Joan, canned tomatoes every August so we wouldn't have to buy produce all winter, and she kept doing it long after we could afford not to, because the cabin had become less of a building and more of a covenant between them. When my father passed, my mother couldn't bear to sell it. When she passed 4 years after him, she left it to me outright, no conditions, just a single line in the will that said, "To my daughter Bridget, who loved that place as much as we did." I was 31. I cried in the lawyer's office in a way that embarrassed me a little, the ugly kind of crying you can't stop once it starts, because I understood exactly what that line meant. It meant 26 years of mortgage payments and canning jars and Saturday shifts. It meant every Christmas we'd ever spent up there with the wood stove ticking, and my father reading the same farmer's almanac every single year like it might say something different. I met my husband, Callum, 2 years after my mother died. He was kind in the unhurried way some men are, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He helped me clear out my mother's closet without making it weird. He fixed the dock at the cabin the first summer we were together without being asked, just noticed it was loose and spent a Saturday on his knees with a drill. I thought I had found someone who understood what that place meant without me having to explain it twice. We got married in Barrie, small wedding, 80 people, and moved into a house in Aurelia that we bought together. Our names on that deed equally, 50-50, the way it should be for a house we built together from nothing. But the cabin stayed mine. Just mine. I never changed that, and Callum never asked me to. Not in so many words, not for the first 3 years. The shift started the way these things always start, which is to say quietly, in sentences that sound almost reasonable if you don't look at them too closely. It began with his mother, Eleanor. No, wait, that's not right. His mother's name was Patricia Sandford, mentioning, more and more, how much she loved the lake. She'd been up to the cabin maybe 6 times over those 3 years, always polite, always complimentary, about my mother's antique sideboard or the quilt my grandmother made, and I genuinely liked her, or thought I did. Patricia was recently widowed herself. Her husband, Roy, had died of a stroke 18 months earlier, fast and without warning, the kind of death that leaves a person standing in the wreckage of a life they didn't plan for. She'd sold the family home in Barrie because it was too big and too expensive to heat alone, and she'd moved into a 1-bedroom condo near the hospital where she got her checkups. I felt for her. I really did. But feeling for someone and handing them the deed to your dead parents' cabin are 2 very different things, and somewhere along the way, Callum stopped understanding the difference. It started with him saying, almost offhand, while we were doing dishes one night in October, that his mom had been having a hard time in that condo. No view, paper-thin walls, a downstairs neighbor who smoked on the shared balcony. I said that sounded rough and asked if she'd looked at other places. He said rentals were brutal right now, which was true. Anyone in Ontario could tell you that, with average rent climbing the way it had, and a 1-bedroom in a town like Aurelia or Barrie running you close to $2,000 a month if you wanted anything decent. I nodded along, sympathetic, and didn't think much more of it. Then in November, he brought it up again, except this time it wasn't really a question. He said maybe Mom could spend the winter up at the lake. Just until spring, just until she found something better. The cabin sat empty most of the winter anyway, he said, except for the 2 or 3 weekends we drove up to ski or just to sit by the fire. Wasn't it a waste, he said, letting a perfectly good place sit cold and dark while his mother shivered in a condo that smelled like someone else's cigarettes? I told him I understood the impulse, but that the cabin wasn't really set up for full-time winter living. The pipes needed the heat trace cable running constantly. The driveway wasn't plowed, unless we called specifically. The propane bill alone for a whole winter would run into the thousands. He said he'd already looked into all of that. He'd already called the propane company. He'd already asked a guy from work about plowing rates. I sat with that for a second. He'd already called. Without me. I let it go that night because I was tired, and because I didn't want our marriage to turn into a fight over hypotheticals. But the comments didn't stop. They multiplied. Patricia needed stability. Patricia deserved somewhere peaceful after losing Roy. Patricia had always loved that lake. Hadn't she said so herself every single time she visited? Wasn't family supposed to take care of family? I noticed, the way you notice a draft in a room before you find its source, that he never once said, "Ask Bridget," or if Bridget's okay with it. It was always just an unfolding plan, narrated to me after the fact, as though my agreement was a formality that would naturally follow once I heard enough reasons. The night it became impossible to ignore was the first Saturday of December. We'd driven up to the cabin for what I thought was a normal weekend. Close it up properly for deep winter, drain a few more lines, bring back the canoe. Callum had been quiet on the drive, which should have told me something. We got there around 4, the light already going gray over the lake, and I was in the kitchen putting away the groceries we'd brought, when he sat down at my mother's old oak table, the one my father refinished the same summer I got my driver's license, and said he wanted to talk. He said he'd been thinking, and that he thought it made the most sense for his mom to move into the cabin starting in January. Not just visiting, moving in. He said she could take the smaller bedroom, the one that used to be mine as a kid. And that he'd already mentioned it to her, and she was thrilled. She'd already started picturing how she'd hang her late husband's photographs on the wall. I stood there with a bag of frozen peas in my hand and asked him to repeat that, because some part of me needed to hear it twice to believe it. He repeated it, word for word, almost rehearsed, the way you say something you've practiced in the shower or the car. He said it like it was already decided, like we were discussing logistics, rather than asking permission. And then he said the thing that I have turned over in my mind every day since, the thing that told me everything I needed to know about how he'd come to see our marriage and my inheritance, and the years his mother-in-law and father-in-law spent paying down a mortgage on a lake they loved. He said, "Bridge, what's yours is ours now. That's what marriage means." I didn't answer right away. I set the peas down on the counter very deliberately, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake, and you don't want him to see it. I asked him carefully whether he understood whose name was on the deed. He said of course he did, but that didn't matter. Not really, not between a husband and wife. We shared everything else, didn't we? Our bank account, our car, ours last name even. So why would the cabin be any different? I asked him if he'd forgotten that his name had never been on this particular deed because I had never put it there, on purpose, because this place wasn't something I built. It was something I inherited. An inheritance, in my mind, in Ontario law, and frankly in basic human decency, sits in a different category than the things a couple builds together after the wedding. He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at me like I was being difficult about something that should have been simple. 3 days later, on the Tuesday, Patricia showed up at our house in Aurelia with 2 suitcases already packed, sitting in the trunk of her Buick like she'd been waiting for the green light her whole life. I remember opening the door and seeing those suitcases through the back window of her car before I even saw her face, and something in my stomach dropped the way it does when you understand a thing has already been set in motion without you. She came in with that same warm, practiced friendliness she'd always had, complimenting the smell of whatever I had simmering on the stove, asking how my work was going. I'm a claims adjuster for an insurance company in Barrie. Steady work, not glamorous, but it paid for things. And then, without much preamble at all, she said she'd brought a few boxes of Roy's things she wanted to put up at the lake house. And did I think the smaller bedroom got good morning light because she'd always wanted a room that caught the sunrise. The lake house, not my cabin. The lake house, like it was a shared family asset, like she had equity in it simply by virtue of having visited it 6 times and admired the quilt. I felt the floor tilt a little under me, the particular vertigo of realizing 2 people have been having a conversation about your life and your inheritance without you in the room. I looked at Callum, who was standing near the stairs with his hands in his pockets, and he wouldn't quite meet my eyes, which told me he knew, on some level, that he'd overstepped, but had already gone too far down the road to turn the car around. Patricia held her hand out to me then. Actually held it out, palm up, the universal gesture for give me something, and asked, with the kind of casual entitlement that takes real effort to manufacture, if I could get her a copy of the cabin key cut before the weekend, since she'd like to head up Friday and get settled before the snow came in. The kitchen went very quiet. I could hear the fridge humming, the particular rattle it always made when the compressor kicked on, and somewhere upstairs the furnace clicked over. I could hear Callum shift his weight near the stairs. And in that silence, I felt something move through me that wasn't rage, not yet, but something colder and steadier. The specific calm that arrives when you finally see a situation in its entirety instead of in pieces. I looked at Patricia's outstretched palm. I looked at her face, which had the expression of a woman entirely confident that the world would continue arranging itself around her, and I smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the smile you give a guest to keep the peace. The smile of someone who knows precisely what they are about to do and has simply been waiting for the right moment to do it. I set my wooden spoon down on the rest beside the stove. I wiped my hands on the dish towel slowly, because I wanted the next few seconds to feel as deliberate as I needed them to be, and I said, "Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to clear it up right now, while the three of us are standing here together." My voice didn't shake. I want to be honest. It surprised me too. Callum took a small step forward, the way people do when they sense a room sliding out of their control, and Patricia's hand stayed where it was, palm up, patient, waiting. The posture of someone who had simply never been told no before, and didn't yet understand that the rules of this particular room had quietly changed. I told her the cabin was not Callum's to offer her, because it had never belonged to him in the first place. I told her it wasn't something I was willing to share the way she seemed to be imagining, as some kind of communal family asset that came along with marrying her son. I told her slowly, so there could be no confusion later, that the cabin belonged to my parents first. That my father's 9 years of Saturday overtime shifts were in the timber of that place. That my mother's 26 summers of canting tomatoes, so we'd never go without, were folded into its walls. And that when my mother signed it over to me in her will, she wasn't handing me real estate. She was handing me the only physical proof that two people loved each other and loved me enough to spend their whole working lives building something solid. And I told her I was not going to hand any piece of that over to a woman who showed up at my front door with suitcases already packed and called it the lake house before she'd even been invited to stay. Patricia's hand dropped. Not gradually. It dropped the way things drop when your body simply stops holding them up. All at once, gravity finally winning. Her face, which had carried that warm, certain confidence since she walked through the door, did something I had never once seen it do in 3 years of holiday dinners and birthday parties. It went still. Then it went pale, a genuine, unrehearsed kind of pale, the color just emptying out of her like someone had pulled a plug. Callum said my name. Just my name, the way you say someone's name when you don't have anything else ready to follow it. I turned to him because what came next was really for him, not for her. I told him I loved him, and that I had meant every word I said when we got married at that little church outside Barrie with 80 people and a borrowed sound system. But I told him love didn't mean handing over the only thing I had left of my parents to a person, however kind, however recently, grieving, who was not my parent and had no claim to what they built. I told him what's mine is ours, was true for the things we'd made together, our house in Aurelia, our savings, our life. But my parents' inheritance was a different category entirely, sacred in a way that didn't bend just because we'd signed a marriage license. And somewhere in his planning he had blurred those two categories together, and I needed him to separate them again, immediately, out loud, in front of his mother. I walked to the hallway closet where I kept the lockbox with our important documents. The same lockbox my mother used for 40 years before me, dented at one corner from a move in the 80s she used to tell stories about, and I pulled out the property folder. My mother had organized it the way she organized everything, in chronological order, every receipt and tax document, and the original deed transfer paperwork from when my parents first bought the place, right through to the probate documents naming me as sole owner after she passed. I set it on the kitchen table. I opened it to the page that mattered and turned it to face both of them, and I tapped the line with my finger once. My name. Only my name. Not Callum's name, not a joint tenancy, not a family trust. Mine in the kind of plain black ink that doesn't leave room for negotiation. Patricia looked at it for a long time. Callum looked at it too, and something shifted in the line of his shoulders. A slow deflation, like air, leaving something that had been overinflated for longer than either of us wanted to admit. I told Patricia, without cruelty but without softening it either, that she was welcome at the cabin as a guest, the same as she'd always been. That guest rooms exist for guests. That I held no grudge against her personally, and no desire to drive a wedge between her and her son, but that the conversation about keys, about moving in permanently, about treating my parents' cabin as some kind of retirement solution for her, was finished. It had ended the moment she held her hand out expecting a key, and she would understand that clearly before she left my house that evening. She didn't leave angry, which surprised me, because I had braced for anger. She left with something quieter, a kind of recalibration, The particular look of someone realizing the room they'd walked into was not the room they had planned for. Callum drove her back to her sister's place in Bracebridge that night, an hour each way in the dark and the first real snow of the season, and came home close to 11 and sat across from me at our own kitchen table. Our table. The one we'd bought together at a furniture store in Barrie on a Saturday afternoon 2 years earlier, and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "I should have talked to you before any of this happened." I told him he was right. He said he knew that now in a way he hadn't let himself know it before, when it was just a series of small comments that felt harmless on their own. I told him knowing it now was the only version of knowing we had available to us, so that was where we'd have to start. We spent the next several weeks having the kind of conversations married people avoid until they absolutely cannot avoid them anymore. He admitted that watching his mother grieve and struggle financially had scared him more than he'd let on, that Roy's sudden death had rattled something loose in him about his own mortality and his obligations as a son, and that somewhere in that fear he had stopped seeing me as a partner in the decision and started seeing me as an obstacle to manage around. I told him that was the most honest thing he'd said to me in months, and that I needed him to understand that fear doesn't entitle you to someone else's inheritance, even when the fear is real and the person you love is hurting. We found Patricia a one-bedroom apartment in a seniors building in Barrie through a program her church recommended, subsidized enough that it didn't strain her pension, with better insulation and neighbors her own age, and a small balcony where she eventually started keeping a tomato plant every summer, which felt, when I first saw it, like a strange and not entirely unwelcome echo of my own mother. Callum called her twice a week. She came to the cabin twice that following summer, once for the May-long weekend and once in August, and both times she knocked before walking through any door that wasn't already open, and both times she left the smaller bedroom exactly as she found it. It wasn't warm right away between us, I won't pretend it was. But it became something steadier than warmth, something closer to respect, which I've come to think might be the more honest version of warmth anyway. It doesn't ask you to feel a thing you don't feel yet. It only asks you to acknowledge what's actually true and to act accordingly. My parents never knew any of this happened, and they never will, because they're both gone now, and some things you simply carry on your own rather than pass along, even in memory. What I know is that the cabin still smells the way it always has: cedar, wood smoke, the particular mineral coolness that comes off Lake Muskoka in February, even through closed windows. My father's 9 winters of overtime are still in those timber walls. My mother's 26 summers of canned tomatoes are still in that foundation, in the cellar shelves she lined with newspaper every single August without fail, and the key to that cabin sits exactly where it has always belonged, in my hand, where my parents put it.